I love a good story in a game. I hate a bad story in a game. Pretty obvious, right? I love Xenoblade Chronicles. It's my absolute favorite game because of how epic the story is. I hate Genshin Impact because the ho-hum story drags the rest of the game down, and you're forced to endure it even to progress through the game. I eventually stopped playing and uninstalled it from my computer. My favorite Zelda game is Link to the Past. It does have story elements in it, but I always skip them. I couldn't tell you about any of the lore of that game because I always mash through the dialogue. Whether a game has story or not, the game needs to be well executed for me to appreciate it. I say all this to establish I'm not someone who hates any game which has story, as my favorite games are heavy narrative games. Xenoblade Chronicles, Tales of Symphonia, and Baten Kaitos Origins are my top 3 all time. The narrative of Miyamoto hating story is a gross misunderstanding. Much of it centered around the handling of the Paper Mario series. Miyamoto made a statement about not needing story for this game or wanting less of a narrative for the game. This has been misinterpreted as a disdain for story. The actual reason for him saying this was because it's Mario, arguably the most successful video game franchise ever, which has thrived without the need for a narrative. With the success of Final Fantasy and Grand Theft Auto at the time, games were beginning to shift to being much more focused on story narrative in games. Still, Super Mario continued to be successful without these elements. Miyamoto, who said in the interview he does not focus on narratives in games anywhere near how the makers of Final Fantasy do, who is a person who does not look to follow trends, as Nintendo as a whole doesn't follow trends, they set them. He wanted his beloved franchise to remain as is, a gameplay-focused game. Mario and Zelda were not built on story narratives but on gameplay. This has nothing to do with hating story in games, and much more to do with maintaining the core elements for its monumentally successful franchises and not feeling they need to follow the crowd. A popular content creator, who will remain nameless, quoted Miyamoto essentially saying he preferred one way of making a game over another and comparing gameplay versus narrative, and this person insisted this meant he disliked story. How does preference for how someone makes a game turn into disdain? Again, Miyamoto on Paper Mario is about believing Mario doesn't need narrative, and he's right. It's the most successful franchise without it, and Paper Mario has never been a blockbuster hit, not even on Switch. Paper Mario is a C-list series which Nintendo can keep making because of how successful their A-list mainline Mario series is, the one without any story. It has nothing to do with the position of story being bad for video games. Story narrative is simply not the way Miyamoto approaches game development. That's really the long and short of it. This whole discussion is just people who like story running with a false narrative about someone who is supremely successful who won't cater to their personal preferences. Do Square and Rockstar hate gameplay? Of course not. They just favor heavy narrative in their games. Really, it just seems like gaslighting because someone won't give you what you want. Play a different game. Miyamoto doesn't want Mario to go down the slippery slope of becoming a story-driven game, especially when it doesn't need to. Miyamoto would never make games like Final Fantasy or Grand Theft Auto. Does this mean he hates these games? If you want to accuse him of gatekeeping Mario, that's perfectly fine, but saying he hates story is a grossly short-sighted take. Hatred for story isn't the motivation behind anything he said. If heavy narrative is your thing, then Mario and Zelda aren't for you. Play Xenoblade, you'll love it. Or play Baten Kaitos Origins, a criminally underrated RPG that needs more exposure. I'm sure Miyamoto loves those too, even though he would never make games like that. Different styles for different folks. Some focus on first-person shooters, some do sports games, some make heavy narrative games, others do platformers. One who is very good at making one type of game won't do so well in another, and may not be interested in making another. Everyone has their lane. As the saying goes, don't fear the man who practiced 1,000 kicks one time, but fear the man who practiced one kick 1,000 times. The biggest and most successful companies and people in the world are the ones who are extremely good at one particular thing. You don't become great by doing a bunch of stuff. You become great by mastering one thing to the point where you show people new and inventive ways of doing that one thing. Miyamoto doesn't need to make a game centered around heavy narrative to be considered a genius, nor does he need to do it to prove to disgruntled people he appreciates a good story in a game. I don't want Monolith Soft to take story away from Xenoblade, as this is the core of Xenoblade. I don't want Mario to become a story-driven franchise, because this isn't what the core of Mario is. If a game falls short of what it's trying to accomplish, it's fair to point out its shortcomings. When it comes to wanting a game or franchise to be something other than what it is, you probably just need to go play something else.